Happy Pride, and welcome to Tangled Twists. I'm Lissa, and today we will be making my Pride 2025 outfit. About 4 years ago, I decided that I wanted to make a new outfit for Pride every year. Most of my clothes are in earth tones, but I really love bright and bold colors, and I figured Pride would be a great way to start introducing fun, colorful garments into my wardrobe, but not so fast that they got to be overwhelming. So for instance, this dress that I'm wearing is one of my previous Pride projects. This year, I wanted to do something really over the top, but I was having a really hard time deciding on anything. It's remarkably challenging to come up with something that's interesting, but can also be done in a short period of time because I didn't start planning this really early on. And it just so happens that this year, the witch dance troupe that I belong to was going to be performing in the Pride Parade. So I thought, let's make a Pride witch. Great idea. So I started combining some witchy motifs with some rainbow motifs, trying to work things together, and I came up with this peekaboo skirt design where I could have the witchy looking outside of the skirt reveal the pride portions of the skirt. And then, of course, the witchy portions were going to be decorated in pride colors as well. I was going to continue that rainbow motif there. I opted to use a pattern that I already had a number of years ago. I made what I called my petal skirt, which is a circle style skirt that's made from panels. And I figured that that would be a good way to construct a skirt that had some hidden flair to it. So we are going to go and hop on into that. First things first, I need to trace out my pattern. I'm using one of my existing patterns for this skirt, but my body has changed since I last used it, so I need to make some adjustments. The fastest way to do that is to trace it out and make my changes. I know the top and sides are straight lines, so I can transfer them easily with my ruler. The curve I'll need to do by hand. I start by tracing the existing pattern, and then I mark where the changes need to go so that I'm doing most of the work in one step. I can add my new lines as I make them. The curve is a little tricky for the adjustment, but you absolutely can use a straight ruler to make curves. The trick is to take it in small sections. I'm lining up the pattern edge with a line on the ruler so that the edge of the ruler is at the desired adjusted amount. Then I draw a small straight line with the ruler. Those lines are only as long as the section of the ruler touching the pattern edge. That's the crucial step. As long as they're short and along that line, you'll get a really nice curve. Once I've made a bunch of the small lines, I can connect them by hand. The more lines you make, the easier the process is. We're going to go through a quick crash course on what to do when you mess up. I did not double check the measurement that I needed to add to the skirt panel before I started on it, so I did it wrong. I added 1/4 inch to each side instead of 1/8 of an inch to each side because I needed to end with 1/4. That means I have extra lines. If you end up in a situation like this where you have extra lines and you think, I'll just go and add the lines that I need and everything will be fine, do yourself a favor and put little X marks or some kind of mark. It doesn't have to be an X, but any kind of mark on the line that you're not paying attention to. Do not trust yourself. You will not remember. You will cut the wrong thing and you will have to do it again. So, since you're already doing one thing again, the easiest way is to go ahead and even put those marks there before you've even finished tracing everything out, because you know these lines are wrong and you don't want to use them for anything other than getting your new correct lines in place. And then you can be reasonably certain that you're not going to cut where you're not supposed to. It still happens, but it's a lot less likely to if you mark your bad lines. Now that I have my pattern adjusted, I need to make copies of it. For this skirt, I need 3 patterns. One for the painted panels, one for the rainbow panels, and one for the stencil. I need to transfer the main pattern lines and the seam allowance lines for all of my copies. For something like this, it's always best to have as much information as possible. You never know when you're going to need it. It also means they're all the same, so any of the copies can be any option to start with. The painted panel doesn't need any more work, so I can go ahead and get my black pieces cut. I need to cut 8 panels. I know they're going to be at least a little wiggly, but exact grain is less of a concern here, so I've doubled the fabric over and I'm cutting the panels as closely together as possible to conserve fabric. I'm working on one of my 2-yard cuts of linen, and it was almost enough. I had to make my last 2 panels on my second piece, but that still leaves me with a lot of usable leftovers. For my rainbow panels, I need to decide how I want to stripe them. To get even stripes, I'm measuring out the full length of the panel and then dividing it evenly for each color. Since it isn't an even number, I'm putting all of the extra into the red panel. I've chosen to put it there since the red panel is the smallest and it will be the least visible in the final garment. If its stripe is a little longer than the others, it will still look pretty even and it will make sure that the red shows up. From there, I draw lines straight across and at an angle so I can see which looks better. I had to make some adjustments to make the diagonals look okay, and I did wind up liking the diagonals best, so that's what I moved forward with. To make the patterns for the rainbow panel, I have to cut apart the stripes. Each stripe has been labeled with an initial so I know what color it's supposed to be and so I know which end is up. It doesn't really matter how you label the pieces in a setting like this, as long as you get a label on them. It is essential when you're working with smaller, oddly shaped pieces that there is some way for you to tell where they're supposed to go. You may think you'll remember, but you won't. I'm tracing out the red and orange pieces a second time because they're going to be a little special. I need to put a zipper in the skirt, and I can't do it along one of the main seam lines because of how this skirt is going to be constructed. The zip is going to have to go in the center of a rainbow panel, so I need to account for that. Once the pieces are cut, I need to add seam allowance to the cut edges. I should also have added registration marks by this point. It would have made my life a lot easier if I had given myself a consistent way to line the pieces up instead of assuming I could do it by eye. I did put grain line marks on them, which turned out to be a good call. The pieces look a lot different when you're using them, so make sure to include grain line on pieces where direction matters. I've saved all the offcuts from making the panel patterns, so I'm using that scrap to add my seam allowance. If I decide I really like this pattern, I might go back and trace these out so I can have a clean copy. I can use them again, but because there's tape on them, it makes it hard to iron if they get wrinkled. I have a yard of each color of linen, which is more than enough, but I still want to get as much use out of each color as I can. That means cutting each color piece as efficiently as possible. Normally, I would trace each piece, but I need at least 8 pieces of each color, and they are all pretty small, so I'm going to cut as I go to save some time. I've lined up the top edge of the pattern piece with the selvage for the first piece, and I'm keeping my grain line on the cross grain. Cross grain follows the side-to-side fibers, or weft, instead of the up and down fibers, or warp, that makes the grain. Cross grain is technically not as sturdy as on grain, but these panels aren't going to be taking weight or pressure, so the slight difference between grain and cross grain can be safely ignored. For the second piece, I'm flipping the pattern piece and using the angled cut to align my pattern. This saves me a cut and helps keep my pattern piece in the correct orientation. I'll cut out each color this way. Red and orange only get 7 normal pieces, where all the others get 8. What would be the 8th piece for red and orange are the split pieces that will be holding the zipper. I sneak them in when there's a little bit of extra space. Then we're on to assembly line work. I like to batch sew because it's very efficient. To make a batch, I'll prepare as many seams as practical and then go sew, press, and seam finish all of them before moving to the next batch. This is the prep for my first batch. I'm pairing my stripes here, red with orange, yellow with green, and blue with purple. I could pin every stripe in place, but doing so increases the chance of catching extra fabric in the seams that I'm making. It's also easier to finish seams that don't have a lot of fabric around them. Once those 3 sets are prepared, then I'll attach blue to green and finally orange to yellow. Since I'm right-handed, doing it in that order ensures that I have the least amount of fabric possible in my left hand and makes the felling process easier. The zipper pieces get handled sort of the same way, but will be attached later. I'll sew the red pieces to their orange counterparts and fell the seam, but then they get set aside until the zip is installed. At the machine, I'm following best practice and sewing each section together in the same direction. This is important here because the edges are on an angle, which means they're on a bias. It's not the true bias, which is 45 degrees from the grain, but it is angled enough to make the edges stretchy. The sewing machine does put tension on the fabric, and these panels will stretch as they're sewn, so I want all the stretch to be in the same direction. That also means I need to do my best to put as little pressure on the fabric as I can as I'm guiding it so that I don't distort the shape of the piece. There are going to be a lot of seams on this skirt, and linen is notorious for fraying, so all of the seams will need to be finished. It would have been faster to use my serger here, but then I would have had a lot of floppy seam allowance bits on the interior of the skirt. It may not seem like a big deal, but having that many loose seams on the inside will drive me up a wall, so I'm putting in the effort to fell each and every one of them. I'm using my standard practice method. Press the seam as sewn, press the seam open, trim one side, press the untrimmed side over, then tuck and press the untrimmed side. Consistency is key here. I'm felling all of my seams in the same direction, pointing them towards the hem of the skirt. That will ensure a uniform look later. After pressing, the edges are whipped down by hand. All 41 of them. But we have an interesting situation here because my fabric is not the same color. Since the red is being whipped to the orange, I'm using orange thread. The thread won't show through the red, but it might on the orange, especially since I'm being speedy. That's what I'll do for each seam. I use the color of the fabric that the seam is being whipped onto. So, the zipper. I've never put a zip in like this before. It needs to be in the center of one of my pieces and in a color block. I looked to some quilting advice and combined it with a variety of zipper instructions and decided on a method. I basted the zipper space closed first. Then I aligned the zip with that opening. I pinned the zip at one end and kept checking that the seam and the zip lined up as I went. Then I hand-basted the zipper to the allowances on both sides. To be able to sew the zip in, I removed the basting stitches from where I sewed the fabric together, and then I sewed the zip in place by hand. I could have used a machine for that part, but I do prefer the control of hand sewing when I'm doing something new and fiddly. With the zip in place, I removed the last of the basting stitches and connected the zip section to the rest of the panel. I used my usual process with one change. By the time I was working on this part, I didn't have time to fuss with more felling, so I didn't fully finish the zip seam. I did prepare it for finishing, though. That let me fell the orange to the yellow seam without compromising my ability to clean up the zipper seam later. Now it's time to make the stencil. The very first thing I need to do here is get my design transferred to the pattern piece. Normally, I sketch in my sketchbook, but it would have been a better idea for this one to have used my gridded notebook. The grid would have allowed me to transfer the pattern more easily using my cutting mat as a matching grid on my pattern. But I didn't, so I'll be transferring this by eye. I'm starting with the moons because they are the easiest. I prefer to use round things to make my circles, so here I'm using a soda can. Once I've made half of my moons, I fold the panel in half and then I trace the moons to the other side. This is the best way to keep this part of the pattern uniform and symmetrical. For my vines, I have another trick up my sleeve. I've taped an extra piece of paper along my side seam. That piece has a line on it to align it with the seam line on the main panel. I'm drawing the vine up that side of the panel, going onto my extra piece of paper. Once I have the vine complete, I remove the extra paper and position it under the other side of the panel. Then I can trace the vine over. Now, if I were to sew those panels directly together, the vines would look even and unbroken up each side. Now that the panel has effectively been framed, it is time to put the snake in. I've never been amazing at drawing snakes, so I've kept it as simple as possible. To get a feel for the sweep of the coils, I do a few practice swipes before marking the paper and committing to my line. Remember, I'm using medical exam paper here. It's not terribly robust and it doesn't handle erasing well, so I need to not need to erase. Once I have the main line, I can start to rough the snake in around it. There is a reason I use medical exam paper and not something else for my patterns. Most of that reason is tracing. It's sturdier than tissue paper, but transparent enough that you can trace it easily. That's a big deal here because the exam paper is in no way sturdy enough to use as a stencil. I have to get that pattern onto something stronger. In this case, that something is poster board. I have a ton of it and it makes a pretty decent stencil if you're careful. This is where the exam paper really shines. It's thin enough that something like a Sharpie is going to soak right through it and mark what's on the other side. All I have to do is trace my design and it will go through to the poster board. It goes through a little on the faint side, so I do then have to go and trace over the light marks to make sure that they're clearly visible. Cutting out the design is where things get a little tricky. The snake and moons are easy enough, but I didn't really think through the vines terribly well. When you draw them, it's just a single pencil line, not like the snake, which has more of a full shape. Fortunately, the Sharpie left a large enough line that I could cut to either side of the line to get the thin line of the vine. You do need to be extremely careful doing this, and not just because razor blades can cut you if you mess up. If you slip here, it can ruin the stencil or provide sneaky places for paint to leak. Every cut needs to be as precise and clean as possible. That's the other advantage to having traced the pattern onto the poster board. If I had messed it up, it would be very easy to trace it out again without having to resketch everything. Now that the stencil is ready, it is time to paint. I collected a bunch of yogurt cups to use for mixing my colors. The game plan is to 50-50 mix each touching color. So where red and orange meet, I have a 50-50 red-orange mix to transition from one color to the other. I know I'll be stippling, which is like dry brushing, so I've also prepared plates that I'll be dabbing my brushes onto. The hard part here is that I know I'm not going to need a lot of paint, but I don't know how much paint I'm going to need. I need to mix enough that I don't need to mix more. Having to mix more than one batch would give me dye lots that may or may not be able to match later, but I also don't really want to waste a lot of paint. From previous stencil experience, I know that once I start going, I can't stop, and that it's going to be impossible to save the paint that I'm using for more than about a day. I settled on taking as close to a half spoonful for each as I could. That does mean I have more mixed paint, but that's a better situation anyway. And at long last, I get to paint. I've marked out my gradient plan on the pattern as a guide for my colors to minimize possible places for mistake. There is a deceptive amount of things at play here. First, I need to secure the stencil. After teasing the fabric into place, I'm using painter's tape to secure the stencil because I know it will come off and I need to use the stencil 8 times. As I start to paint, I'm taking as little paint as I can and dabbing it onto the plate to even it out. Then I dab it onto the fabric using an up and down motion. I don't want to use brush strokes here, as they will cause the fabric to shift and push paint under the stencil, which will affect the next panel. I'm keeping all of the paint to one side where I can access it. My extra paint is on the same side as the paint plates in case I need more. You never, ever want to be transferring paint over your project. There is a non-zero chance that something will drop on your work, and you don't want that. By keeping all of the paint together and only moving the brush above the stencil, it eliminates a lot of possibility for oopses. It took a bit to figure out the best order to paint here. Since the color will be in a gradient, I don't want my unmixed color brushes touching any mixed color. That means that I need to put on red and orange before joining them with the 50-50 red-orange mixture. It's okay if the 50-50 brush gets an unmixed color because both colors are already in there. You also want to work at a very steady pace. Going fast gives you the opportunity for mistakes, but going too slowly gives you uneven drying on your work or your paint drying out before you're done. I set aside a whole day for this just to be safe, and it wound up taking a solid 3 hours with no breaks. I learned pretty quickly that the white paint liked to dry out and the orange paint stayed wet the best. Any mixed paint was a blend between the paints that went into it. But wait, there's more. My stencil is poster board, which is paper. Paper absorbs moisture. So as the paint is drying, the paper is actually getting wetter and wetter. That makes it hard to work with as time goes on because it can start to warp and twist. It also gets softer, which makes it mushy and makes it harder to stencil in fine and narrow details. Because of that, you end up needing to handle your stencil quite a bit. That means you're going to want a clean hand and a painty hand, and you always need to know exactly what your painty hand is touching so you don't put paint where it doesn't belong. When you finish painting, you remove the tape and pull the stencil up and off as easily as you can. It's covered in wet paint, so be careful where you set it and how you're handling it. Per my paint instructions, I let my panels dry overnight and then set them the next morning with my iron. Since I'm working on a cellulose fabric, those are the ones made from plant fibers, I need the paint to get to 300 Fahrenheit for 1 minute. But it's also unset right now, so I can't iron over it directly. I need parchment paper between the iron and the paint. I'm using my iron on the highest heat with no steam. All steam is going to do in this situation is make the parchment paper harder to handle. My iron isn't big enough to do the whole thing in one go, and it's generally not a good idea to leave an iron sitting in one spot. So I opted to make small circular motions over a small area for a minute each. I did use a timer for this. It took me 3 hours to paint those panels, and the last thing I want is for the paint to not set properly and come off in the wash. I was able to divide the panels into 4 sections that ensured full coverage of the whole design, but it still took about an hour to set all 8 panels. That brings us to the easy part. All of the bits are done. Now they only need assembly. I'm working in batches again by pairing a painted panel with a rainbow panel. I know my painted panels have more consistent edges because they were cut as a single piece, so I'm lining up the rainbow panel with the black panel and trimming off anything on the rainbow panel that overhangs. That way, when I'm at the machine, I can use the black fabric as a constant guide along my 1/2 inch mark. No matter how wobbly the edge is on the rainbow fabric, the black fabric will be consistent and give me a more even edge. Then it's back to felling as usual. I had hoped to be able to fell the rainbow fabric over the black fabric so that I could sew with black thread and not worry about the black fabric showing through on the lighter colors of the rainbow. Alas, there were enough wobbly edges that I had to do it the other way. The only reason this was a bit of an issue is that it meant I had to change thread colors every time the fabric color changed. It would have taken substantially less time if I could have just felled with a single color. I can fell invisibly, but that takes even more time to do, and I was running out of time at this point. So I chose to change thread colors because it would let me sew faster. I followed the same batch concept assembling the panels that I did for making the rainbow panels. I made 8 pairs of painted and rainbow panels, then I paired those 8 panels into 4, those 4 panels into 2, and the 2 panels into 1, felling the seams in between each sewing. The panels started to get really unwieldy as more and more of them were connected. There is a lot of fabric in this skirt, and every time I handled it, I could feel the stress on the waist, so I started putting my pleats in to help stabilize the waistline. To prepare the fabric, I folded the seam between the rainbow and painted panels, and I pinned it on the painted panel side. Then I pulled the painted panels on each side of the rainbow panel over the rainbow panel. I centered the top of the rainbow panel behind the painted panels and pinned it into place. Whenever you're doing something with pleats like this, it's important to move as much of the fabric as you can to keep the pleat even. Pinning down along the pleat helps with that. Once the pleats were pinned, I secured them with 2 rows of basting stitches. I took a single back stitch on each end to help secure the stitching so that it would stay in place long enough to get the waistband on. I didn't get the film on it, but the waistband is a long rectangle that is 3 inches longer than my waist. It's also 3 inches wide. When finished with a 1/2 inch allowance, that gives a 1 inch waistband with a 2 inch overlap for the closure. I applied the waistband starting at the zip edge, and I kept the band on the machine side as I was sewing. By keeping the pleats up, I was able to control them as they went through the machine and under the presser foot and prevented them from drifting or getting folded over as I worked. Pressing the waistband was a thing. I needed to make sure to press it away from the skirt, but I also needed to make sure the pleats didn't get pressed strangely. If the pleats were pressed wrong, it could cause the rainbow fabric to hang weird so that it showed instead of hiding behind the painted panels like I intended. I also had to wrangle 16 panels worth of fabric. There is a lot of skirt here, and it makes handling it kinda complicated. Once the waistband was pressed out, I turned it to the inside and whip stitched it down. I started at the end with the overhang and whipped that close before moving down and along the band and up to the opening on the other side. Which takes us to the hem. This skirt has a lot of hem. 32 feet of it to be precise, and it's all curves. To get me started, I used my sewing machine and a bright thread to mark my seam allowance all the way around the hem. Now, there are a lot of options for how a skirt hem can be finished. You can fully line the skirt, you can put in a facing, you can use tape or binding, or you can do a turned hem. I chose the turned hem for several reasons. I've used this pattern before for a plain 8-panel skirt, and I lined that. It was heavy. As heavy as this one, actually, because they both have 16 panels worth of fabric. If I had lined this, I wouldn't have had to finish the seams, but I would have had 32 panels of fabric, which would have made it absurdly heavy. It would also have caused problems with the peekaboo feature, as the seams would have been extremely bulky. Using a facing would have given the same effect as lining at the hem, but the facing would have stopped after maybe 4 or 5 inches, so I would still have had to finish all the seams, and I would have had a bulkier hem, and I would have had to tack the facing down. Binding the hem would have been a viable option, except that the hem changes colors. I couldn't just fold the tape over the raw edge, I would have had to turn it under. At which point, I might as well do a turned hem. But a curved edge means the part that I'm turning under is bigger than what I'm going to sew it to, so I need to ease the hem. That means handwork. I turn under a small bit of hem, and then turn under another section nearby. Where it bubbles in between the pins, I turn it under and then wiggle and pull and push the fabric into the curve of the hem and pin that down. Once the panel was pinned from seam to seam, nice and flat, I whip stitched it down. I left the connection between the panels open because they needed some special handling. To get a clean turn, I had to unpick some of that seam to be able to turn under the edges. That's part of why the row of stitches that I put in to measure the hem is important. It tells me where to stop ripping the seam, and it helps to support it. Somehow I lost the footage of putting the closures on, so here's how they came out. I used 2 pants hooks to secure the waistband, and then I used a hook and eye to hold the painted panels in place over the zipper panel. Since I needed the zipper panel to be able to fully open, I can't do any stitching directly on top of the pleat to keep it closed, but I needed something to keep that section in place. I did a quick try on, and I saw very quickly that if I wanted the peekaboo effect, I needed to close the pleats a little more. If the pleat stays open to the waistband, the fabric has a better chance of turning outward and being visible. By closing up the pleat a bit, it helps to hold the pleated panels in place. I used a slip stitch to secure the pleat and measured the first one I did. Then I was able to stitch up all the other pleats to the same measurement amount. Ideally, at this point, I should have pressed all the rainbow seams under the painted panels to help ensure the peekaboo effect, but I ran out of time, so I'll have to get to that later. This is one of those rare projects that goes exactly to plan. Normally you have something that needs to be fudged somewhere. Not on this one, and I have no idea how I pulled this off. There were so many new techniques that I was using. I've never painted fabric before. I've never made a skirt like this before. I've never installed a zip in a split panel. There were just so many new things that I challenged myself with this project. It was absolutely incredible to make. It is so much fun to wear. It was really well received. It looks just, it's so much fun. And when you spin, oh, it's so beautiful when you spin in this thing. I really love how those rainbow panels peek out from in between the snake panels. It's so fantastic. I was able to work extra flags into the painted panels by including the trans flag colors across the bottom for my moons, because transitioning moon phases, trans colors, that made sense to me. I absolutely love how this came out. I've paired it with my scrap bodice from last year. Normally when I have leftover Pride fabrics, I try to get the most out of them. So last year I took my scraps from that dress and made a bodice out of it. And it pairs so incredibly nicely with this skirt. It made just an absolutely amazing witchy outfit. I grabbed my Pride witch hat that I made last year as well. I really like it for like the surprise of color around the brim. Everything just turned out so incredibly amazing on this skirt. And I realized that I didn't include anything on the making of the pattern because I've had this pattern for several years. It is one that I drafted myself. So if you are interested in how to make a panel skirt, go ahead and drop a comment and let me know, and I can work out the math on that so that you can make something fun like this as well. So I hope you are all having a wonderful and happy, safe Pride month, and I look forward to seeing you back here real soon. Bye-bye.